Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am presenting this paper for Peter. All I've done is the computer work to present it. In 1950, Emanuel Velikovsky, in his book Worlds in Collision, told of a catastrophic encounter between Earth and Venus that caused not only the 10 plagues of Egypt and the Exodus, but also dramatically increased Earth's orbit. It is perhaps unfortunate he called his book Worlds in Collision, because electromagnetic forces seem to prevent cosmic bodies carrying a large charge difference from colliding. It would appear that smaller bodies carry a large charge difference, usually explode before contact, the Russian bolide being a typical example. But larger cosmic bodies repel one another. Although many scientists maintain that Velikovsky's theory about major changes of the planet's orbits within the lifetime of mankind was impossible, there were some within the SIS, Robert Bass and Lawrence Dixon, who claim that nothing in Newton's laws makes it so. While we have read papers by them and others on the possibility of orbit change, we have read none that analyse what happened during the Exodus catastrophe, as described in Worlds in Collision. This is our attempt at such an analysis. We are now fortunate in having the benefit of 40 years of SIS research into the solar system and Earth's history as recorded worldwide in mythology, biblical and other ancient records. Also, space research with probes traversing space and visiting the planets and comets has shown that magnetic fields are everywhere in space, and the electricity in space can provide a far more powerful force for change than gravity alone, by a factor of 1,000 billion times more than gravity. That figure has come from Wallace Thornhill and the electric universe, but it's been used many times. Before we look at the catastrophe, let's establish what forces we're dealing with. Earth's mean orbit is 93 million miles from the Sun, which means it travels some 584 miles per year, or 1.6 miles per day at 66,000 miles an hour. Its current orbital momentum, that's mv, is a multiple of this, and its mass, which is 6.1 times 10 to the 20th tons. Venus is currently travelling faster, completing its orbit of 422 million miles in 224.7 days at a speed of over 78,000 miles an hour, as its mass is less than Earth at 5 times 10 to the 20th tons. So its momentum is currently 96% of that of Earth. So it's a similar momentum, but it's got a different orbit. We cannot assume that these energy levels were the same prior to the Exodus catastrophe, because while a change of direction is the most obvious effect when two moving bodies, such as snooker balls, drive one another, there is also an exchange of momentum. Furthermore, if both Earth and Venus had the later encounters with Mars, as Velikovsky maintains, these must have involved some exchange of both charge and momentum. For the moment, let's put aside the question of electromagnetic forces, except to say that it was through those forces that the charge differences and orbital momentum of the planets were exchanged. Since Earth's rotation is so much faster than that of Venus, its influence on the Exodus catastrophe is probably minimal, so we will ignore any changes in this analysis. Now, the pre-catastrophe situation. According to Velikovsky, prior to the Exodus, Venus had an eccentric orbit which went inside Earth's orbit at its perihelion, and as it approached Earth, it looked like a comet with an illuminated head and long tail. I'm afraid I couldn't do the artistry to put a great long tail in the background, but use your imagination. It was so big, it got the population of the world very worried. Imagine seeing this in the sky by day and night, until it reaches perhaps as much as 20 times the size of the moon. Velikovsky thought that Jupiter had given birth to Venus in the 2nd millennium BC. He said this twice in Worlds in Collision, first in Part 1, Chapter 8, under the section titled The Four-Planet System, then again in Chapter 10, in the last paragraph of the section, Venus Becomes the Morning Star. Prior to the Exodus, that he stated to about 1450 BC, Velikovsky said that Venus had been involved in or caused both the Sodom and Gomorrah and Job catastrophes. In Part 2, Chapter 5 of Worlds in Collision, he identified Venus and Mars as the archangels Michael and Gabriel, both of whom featured in the Sodom and Gomorrah story. In Part 1, Chapter 10, he identified Venus as Mazzaroth, that did not appear in its seasons in the book of Job. Prior to the Exodus, Earth and Venus were clearly orbiting the Sun in the same direction and at similar speeds. Now, the catastrophe. The cosmic features of the plagues in Egypt are, and this was when the Earth enters the tail of the comet Venus, first fine dust particles fell in all the land of Egypt, and then the dust changes to larger particles as it plunges deeper in the comet tail. And remember the earlier talk by Mark Bailey showing the dust particles going very close to the comet, and we were obviously that close to the comet at that time. Then as the Earth went further into the tail, a blazing sticky substance falls and runs along the ground. Then falling meteorites and liquid fire with lightning and a thunderous roar. And then followed days of darkness. Now, the terrestrial features of the plagues, and remember what I've just said, this runs more or less in parallel. The Nile turns red, all fish die, and the water is undrinkable. That would have been when the fine dust particles fell in all the land of Egypt. And then later, the Nile swarms with frogs, gnats, and fly swarms. Cattle die. There are boils on man and beast, thunder and lightning and liquid fire that runs on the ground. We're obviously right in the centre of that, the tail of the comet, to get that. And then Earth eventually comes out the other side. Hail and fireballs stop falling, so is apparent tranquility. Then a strong east wind brings locusts to devour all the remaining vegetation. There's not much of it because what's happened before has burnt it or scorched it. Anyway, the locust finished it. And then darkness for between 3 or 9 days, while the angel of the Lord passed over. Another reference to Venus overhead. And then a great earthquake shook the whole world and slew the chosen of Egypt. After the passing over of the Lord, Moses gathered his people, and guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, Moses led his people, there's about 600,000 of them, out of Egypt for several days and encamped on the shore of the Red Sea. That's Exodus 13:21. The angel of the Lord and the pillar of cloud then moved from before the host of Israel to behind them. And the next event, the great ball of the comet approaches again, and a strong east wind drove the waters back, and the Hebrews crossed over on dry land. And the Egyptians drowned when they followed later. Velikovsky says incessant electrical discharges occurred between the tail of the comet and Earth, between the two close approaches. The comet tail is initially like an encircling serpent, and later it distorts with legs and many heads, looking like a ferocious animal. The ferocious animal appears to swallow the comet, but the brilliant, red-faced and bald globe burst out, tearing the monster to pieces. Gas, dust, and other matter of the comet's tail envelops Earth. And the globe of the comet withdrew, but did not break away. All these events happened in sequence, but the Bible doesn't tell us how many days between one thing and the other. We have to infer that. On the 16th day of the second month after leaving Egypt, the glory of the Lord, that is the head of the comet, appeared in the cloud. The next day, the dew on the ground, when dried, became edible, bread of heaven or manna. 3 days after the third new moon following their departure, there were thunders and lightning and a loud trumpet blast, and the Lord came down on Mount Sinai, and the heavens did bow down and the earth shake. And according to Hebrew tradition, all nations heard the roaring of the lawgiving that heralds the start of the seventh world age. Now Peter analyzes the planet's orbits. Prior to the Exodus, Venus had an elliptic orbit with its perihelion inside Earth's orbit and aphelion inside the asteroid belt. That's a very elliptic orbit. The asteroid belt would have lost its coherence if Venus had ever come close to it. The Japanese myth, called the Sun Goddess and Impetuous Male, suggests that the asteroid belt is the after-birth material following Venus's birth from Jupiter. When Venus passed ahead of Earth towards its perihelion, it must have been travelling slightly slower than the Earth. Venus must also have been travelling close to the ecliptic plane to have had 3 or more months of continuous exodus event activity from entering the tail to the comet to the lawgiving. And the Venus orbit is now at 3.4 degrees inclination to that plane, so something has clearly happened since. Earth had passed through the tail of the comet, and the fall of meteorites and fire had ceased before its closest approach when the Lord passed over. It seems likely, therefore, that during the days of darkness, Earth was eclipsed by Venus, which had passed its perihelion and was beginning to move away from the Sun. And Venus may have been close enough to obscure up to 10 degrees of the sky, or 20 times more than our moon. It must have been electromagnetic forces that increased the orbit of the Earth and reduced that of Venus after they came close enough. Velikovsky suggested a cataclysmic thunderbolt at the time of the crossing, but while there is no mention of this in the book of Exodus, we think that the exchange of charge as the Lord passed over may have seen the carving of the Grand Canyon. Wal Thornhill suggested in the SIS review of 2000 that massive interplanetary electrical discharges carved out the Grand Canyon on Earth and the Valle Manieris on Mars, and later attributed the formation of Norwegian fjords to interplanetary discharges. Logic suggests that Earth was forced into a longer orbit and Venus a shorter one. Both planets would then have continued to orbit the Sun in the same direction and same plane. Then Earth would have overtaken Venus again at the time of the crossing. And once again, Earth was forced into a longer orbit and Venus a shorter one. Velikovsky says that Jewish tradition maintains that the Sun changed its course 4 times between the Exodus and the lawgiving. That implies the orbits of the planets were forced apart or changed both on the 16th day of the second month, when the head reappeared in the clouds, as well as at the time of the lawgiving. After the lawgiving, Earth and Venus were both in new orbits, but in overcast conditions, valley of death. So it was several years before Moses could determine the secrets of the calendar, year length and pole position, etc. So he couldn't see the sky because of the dust remaining hanging in the sky. Much of the tail of the comet was captured by Earth's gravity when it plunged through it. The tail included Venus's atmospheric gases, as well as dust and larger debris. The atmosphere is now thought to be 96% carbon dioxide and 3.5% nitrogen, and less than 1% of sulfur, water, and argon. We now know that the tail of a comet is a plasma effect and is always facing away from the sun. Thus, when Venus was in very close conjunction with the Earth, which was enveloped in its active chroma, we can surmise that there would have been much interaction between Earth's upper atmosphere with gases and particles in Venus's tail. These must have produced petroleum products that were then ignited by electrical discharges. It's the origin of fire. And later, edible starches and sugars were produced high in the atmosphere by polymerization of formaldehyde. The irradiation of a mixture of carbon dioxide, hydrogen, carbon monoxide and water vapor during the day could produce the formaldehyde and polymerization that could occur at night when the temperature dropped. That's an interesting point, the necessary conditions for chemical reactions to occur. If manna was produced throughout the time valley of death conditions continued, it's clear that it took many years for Earth's atmosphere to recover from its capture of much of Venus's tail. The reappearance of manna or honey in the stories of Samson and Jonathan suggests that the contamination was repeated in later times when the Earth passed through the plasma-laden magneto-tail of Venus, even though the orbits would have been more circular by then and separation distance would have been greater. That increase of separation distance is why we haven't had any obvious tilting of the Earth and changes of the seasons since. Catastrophes were a milder form. Any such contamination must cast doubt on the carbon-14 dating in biblical times. We must now reference Peter Warlow's book, The Reversing Earth, by Dent in 1982, where he explains how Earth can be inverted without any change of its rotation. During the inversion, hurricane-force winds would be experienced along the axis of the inversion, but there would be none at 90 degrees to that axis. The centrifugally raised equatorial bulge would be affected by the inversion, but water could not keep pace, and at some point the vector of centrifugal force would reverse, and with it the direction of water flow. And after the inversion, everything seen in the heavens would be reversed, with the sun rising in the west and setting in the east. The seasons would also change, with summer becoming winter and winter becoming summer. Ocean currents will also reverse. It is without question that Earth has experienced very large external electromagnetic forces during the 4 close approaches of Venus during the Exodus event. At the same time, Venus, when close enough to cause an inversion, must also have caused massive tidal effects. A strong west wind reported during the days of darkness can be attributed to an inversion, which over 3 days could create a wind speed of well over 100 miles an hour. And Peter's done the calculation. 180 degrees in 72 hours is 2.5 degrees per hour, and a degree of latitude is approximately 60 miles. So 60 by 2.5 gives 180. Well done. The report about the angel of the Lord changing station in the heavens and the retreat and subsequent return of the sea at the time of the crossing can also be attributed to a second inversion. Velikovsky said that according to Hebrew tradition, the sun did not proceed on its course during the day of passage. The strong wind did not change direction. The points of the compasses changed, so that west became east and the west wind became an east wind. There may have been a third inversion the next time the comet came close to Earth, but there is no clear evidence of it. The most convincing evidence that an inversion happened at the time of the lawgiving is that this event saw the beginning of a new world age. Every new world age was supposed to have a new sun, when it travelled in the opposite direction to the old sun, or when the year had a very different number of days. Velikovsky mentioned a Hebrew tradition that the motion of the sun was disturbed during the lawgiving only a few lines after his report of the same thing during the passage. We can be confident that it must be an electromagnetic force that prevented the planets colliding, because gravity is always a force of attraction. The gravitational attraction of Venus at the time of the crossing would have had a massive tidal effect, but the reports about the change of direction of high winds at the same time as changes in the location of things in the heaven suggest that there was almost certainly an inversion at this time. Velikovsky suggested that the heaped up waters fell after a tremendous electrical discharge was exchanged between Venus and Earth, but a reversal of the inversion-induced seawater flow provides a better explanation. The Exodus story implies that Earth and Venus closed with one another 4 times and were forced apart 4 times. And the force that drove them apart must have been electromagnetic. Right, I've got 2 more slides. Between before and after the Exodus crossing, the ages of the patriarchs, and in fact mankind now is living to half the age that they did in the old days. If you look at the top, Isaac, he was a very old man when he died. He's rated at 180. So I would guess that is going to be about 100, 110. But after the Exodus, you can see that Joshua, he'd gone down to 110. But look at the difference of those 3 and compare it with the top ones, 180, 147, 137. There's obviously a higher average age at death than there is after, and we now know that the average age is about 80, so it's about a 2-to-1 difference. This is just to give an idea of the size of the planets and where we are. And I make a particular note of the density of Pluto on the right-hand side and Mercury on the left. Recent photographs that we've seen by courtesy of NASA show both planets to be rocky, very obviously rocky, and similar source. So you'd expect them to have a similar density. So how can our calculations be so wrong? And that's one reason why the Electric Universe, with the latest series from Wal Thornhill, who says that mass can be changed by charge, and therefore the density will change. So it could explain why Pluto was much, much lighter than astronomers expected, but then so are all the comets lighter than they expect. So there is something we don't know, and this is developing science. It's not totally proven yet. It's got to be put to laboratory tests. But so very slowly we're getting there. Anyway,
That last alphabet is totally not me.
There was, I think, plenty of time for questions.
I'll quickly interject a quotation from Robert Feather's book, where he points out that the ages of the patriarchs were the sum of squares of numbers.
Sorry, I haven't read your book.
No, it's just another possible explanation for these numbers.
Yes.
It doesn't affect your theory at all.
There are plenty of possible explanations.
Yes, it does.
Basically, this is an analysis of what Velikovsky has written. I'm not going to argue about the scientists. I'm not a scientist. I trained as an analyst. And when I trained in the 60s, I was told, don't believe everything you read or anything you read. Check it.
Yeah.
And that's the way I approach things. I'm an analyst, and I've tried to work out what Velikovsky's and the Bible's report about the Exodus event actually suggests happened.
Yes, I just wanted to comment that an indication of the closeness that Venus and Earth must have had in the past is the fact that the orbit is synchronized, in that when Venus comes round to closest approaches to Earth, it shows the same face to Earth, and that's really could not have arisen by chance.
Yeah.
And in such a short time.
Yeah, it's one of the big questions that has to be answered between the electric universe people and conventional astronomers, is how it is that I have somewhere a full table of the planets and their dimensions and details about them, and there's some very, very interesting things which Mark Bailey could actually give an instant answer about. And I noticed, for instance, that the large planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus and Neptune, have all got rings. I didn't know any of them had rings apart from Saturn. But they have rings, which is interesting. But they're also gas giants. And the suggestion has been made that by the electric universe people that gas giants are made by losing their centres in some upheaval. Well, that has to be electric, of course, but we're biased. So the birth, where in this paper it's been mentioned that Velikovsky said Jupiter had given birth to Venus, and the Japanese said that it referred to the afterbirth material. It's when one planet is drawn out of a much larger one by electrical forces. It's actually heated up the larger one so hot something had to give, and it develops as a planet. And so anyway, back to questions of Peter.
There's an electron flip thing where an electron can be turned 90 degrees using frequencies, electromagnetic stuff. Is there anything in Velikovsky that says that, like this change of a sun might explain a 90-degree flip or a 90-degree turn for a little while? Because
I don't think he ever discussed that possibility in anything he wrote.
Do you know anything about it?
Well, Peter Warlow's ideas is the best, that an axis shift will occur if an external force was applied as a torque to the equatorial bulge. And depending how strong the force was and how long it persisted, you could have an axis shift of 5 degrees, or you could have an axis shift of 30 degrees, or if it persisted for long enough, as we suggested, 3 days or longer, it could cause a total inversion. I don't know how much force would be needed, how close the planet creating the force would have to come. But Michael Reed, in an analysis, I think it was in a SIS publication in 1977, said the Senmut ceiling decoration, which suggested, well, it shows a sky as it is at the present and an inverted sky, but it also shows Venus covering 8 degrees of the sky out to a viewer on the Earth, which suggests that Venus at the time of Senmut had come that close to the Earth. But the Exodus event, which seems to have been very much worse, would probably involve the Venus getting closer.
A large part of, or some part of Velikovsky's argument involves these inversions which you referred to. And Herodotus mentions the Egyptian priests saying that the sun changed its position 4 times or whatever, as he said. Now, I don't know how going to Australia compares with tip-top inversions, but when I immigrated to Australia, the sun went round the wrong way. And it's the weirdest thing, if you notice the sun at all, that it's turning the wrong way. And yet nowhere in the Bible has anybody looked up in the sky long enough to think, wow, the sun's going around the wrong way. And when we put so much dependence on what it says in the Bible, it seems very strange to me that such a huge omission doesn't cause any concern that perhaps this theory is exaggerated. Though I think these misinterpretations of what is actually being said, and I really don't think we can place any dependence on Velikovsky's interpretation of that. If you read the text, there are plenty of other explanations. And certainly in terms of the potter's wheel turning over or turning round, it's referring to society. The beggar becomes the Lord and the Lord becomes the beggar.
This embarks on all sorts of problems. I mean, whatever we read in the Bible has been translated by somebody, and it's been processed by somebody with much better understanding of what goes on in the world than whoever wrote it. We do know that, as Isaiah said, the world was turned upside down. We do know the Egyptians said the world was turned like a potter's wheel. Now, I don't know what the Egyptian wrote, what he understood, but whoever translated it thought it meant as a potter's wheel. Whoever translated
But it makes perfectly good sense, Peter, the potter's wheel turning. It says that the wheel turns, and it's within the context of social disruption and the lords and the aristocrats losing their land, losing their possessions, and the poor people and beggars coming in and bettering themselves. It's that particular text from Ipua.
Yeah, we still got these ceiling.
Times and very recently.
Yeah, we've got these ceiling decorations showing an upside-down world.
Yes, because it's the lid which, when we put the lid onto the coffin, it is also it's in the correct sense for the person who is being buried.
I don't particularly want to. You seem to be defending, because I think there are a great deal of assumptions in what was presented. But Peter Warlow did get the physics right. The world could turn upside down. Depends on the agent, whatever the force is.
The world could turn upside
But
down, maybe. Why is there no mention of it in the Bible, which we're depending on for all this argument?
As I said, I'm not defending what's said, I'm just explaining the physics. What Peter realised was an object can turn upside down without changing the angular momentum.
And that was his tippy top thing,
Yeah.
because that's what the tippy top does.
The spin
It turns itself
continues.
upside down, but the angular momentum stays the same. So the physics does allow the world to be turned upside down, you know, if there are sufficient forces or whatever to do it. So Peter had a, you know, although again, I wouldn't back up Peter's concepts in total, but because of his example of the tippy top, he did get the physics right. You can turn something that's rotating upside down, and the rotation doesn't change.
It's not described, and I wonder why
No.
they forgot to mention that the sun's going round the other way.
Yeah, but,
I
no.
would think it
Yeah,
would be
I'm with you on
very-
that, Daphne. I just think we have to be clear that what Peter Moreland did, you know, and remember his document was published in a fully reputable journal,
No, I
because
wasn't-
he
I
did
wasn't-
get the physics right.
I wasn't suggesting that that couldn't have happened, although I believe Peter, I believe that he didn't say that it happened during the Exodus.
Okay.
But what I am saying is, when we're placing so much dependence on these particular texts, it seems a very strange omission to me that element of this catastrophe wasn't mentioned.
Well, I believe it was mentioned because with the comet and the pillar of fire and the smoke going from before to behind them suggests an inversion to me.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all.